Welcome to Conflict Managed. I'm your host, Mary Brown. Conflict Managed is a weekly podcast about toxic work environments and how to fix them. We're glad you're here. Good morning, Nikhil, and welcome to Conflict Managed, or I should say good evening, since we are in quite a time difference.
Hi, Mary. Good morning to you, and very nice to be here.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. We're going to be talking about generational differences at work, specifically looking at Gen Z. But before we get to all of that, I would like to hear about the first job you ever had as a young person.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I have to go back in time. But very quickly, my story is broken into two buckets. I spent a little bit of time growing up in India, and then I spent many years in the US. And I think my very first job began there in a very like a typical teenage student in the high school, which was serving at a fast food place, waking up at 4 a.m. and getting ready to serve for a 6 a.m. shift. But it was pretty memorable, and it taught me many things.
What was
Yeah.
memorable about it?
Well, I think it's just adapting to a new environment, a new culture, a new way of working, and the fact that people of my age, and I was surrounded by people of my age who were with me, and in fact working very seriously as a way to support themselves. And I think that was one of the biggest lesson is that it isn't so much what is the job, it is about how at a very young age people do roles which teaches them the value of money, teaches them the value of hard work, and I think so that yeah, there's a lot that I learned just observing people of my age doing something very similar and doing it very regularly and with a lot of discipline.
Yeah, and imagine, I mean, you have such an interesting take on this, moving cultures and being a teenager and seeing maybe your work ethic and maybe your understanding of work from your family of origin and where you grew up. And now you're in the US and you're seeing US teens and others who are in the same environment as you, but maybe the cultural differences, but you're also just this young person growing up in the world, right? And so this is your first time around, and that must have been very memorable.
Absolutely, absolutely. Fortunately, I had a very good a guardian who had been there, and of course, his own children. So, it wasn't. It was sort of it was pretty gentle, and they were always there to guide me. But yeah, I mean, adjusting to cold weather and just the routine. But there's so many positives in any society that we can kind of think about travels is that we can all learn. And I was very fortunate while I look back that it must have felt very harsh then, but I look
Mhm.
back now to say that, okay, I learned so much. And I'm sure all of us, as we travel different parts of the world, at some point in our career, right, even then we can look back to say that it seems pretty tough now, but there's always a good in some of those experiences.
Absolutely. And how to transport that, especially when you're younger. I mean, and even no matter what age, the thinking about the lesson in the hard, when it's hard, we just want to, of course, we don't want that
Yeah.
really toughness, whatever it is, isolation or worry or, pain physically or psychologically. And yet when we have distance, right? Distance is such a gift because we can see what was born out of that. I hear people talking about, to suffer well. And I would like to learn how to do that, not let your suffering be wasted, to suffer well. I think that's certainly something I want to think more about. But it's instructive because when we get distance, we can see hindsight, right? We can see the good in it. It'd be wonderful to see the good while you're in it, which I think is a very mature position. I hope to one day aspire to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you go through your foray in fast food, and then you go to college.
Yes, so I worked through several jobs, Mary, as I'm sure like many students and everybody does, just as a way to learn and support. And so I think that happened, and then the schooling happened as well, again in very cold country in the state of Michigan. And yeah, after that, out in the work world, which was again a very different experience, very different than the college life that one has. So, but the schooling experience again, it teaches you so much. You meet people from different backgrounds and the rigor that's there, and every aspect of the college life, right? From the sports to social life to the academic life, right? I think it all teaches you. So, yeah, a lot of learning again there, and I think we all can look back and say that, okay, well, those were some fun years, but I think it's also like you learned so much, you made friends, and I think we have friends even that I'm in touch now. So yeah, I think just another block of learning in life, and how you can kind of see back and grow from it.
Absolutely. What did you major in college?
I majored in finance. And I started out then looking at a sales career in financial services, which I think is kind of the best thing that could have happened to me. It was kind of going to the school of hard knocks, and much before we had AI and social media and all of that. And so I think it was just good at that age to kind of go through kind of a hard grind. And we had a few other colleagues, people of my age from my school that with a similar degree. And 2 to 3 years of that taught me many things. I mean, just the resilience and how you look at customers, and actually also about money, like the stories that I saw of people who had money and did something good with it versus had money and didn't do good with it, right? So I think it was a very good foundation phase of looking at all of that. And so yeah, it was a good way to kind of practice what you have learned in the school.
So, when you picked a major, why finance? Why did you want to go in that route?
Honestly, I think, Mary, we can all look back and say that, okay, at that stage in our life, or we think that we have the clarity. And I think, I was fairly clear. It looked like that's the career, and I was very determined. And I think I did about 7, 8, 9 years on that path. So I did the sales, and then I moved to the West Coast, and I did work with fund managers, and then I worked and did auditing. So it felt like, okay, this is just what I should have done. But sometimes, it's the old saying, life is what happens to you when you're busy planning what to do with it. And there's a twist and a turn that can happen, and then you look back and say, okay, I don't think I want this. But then again, another patch goes by and you said that, okay, I think that was probably the best thing that could have happened. So I think for me, there was almost a decade worth of work in finance. I don't know, maybe an influence from my family. It just felt like, okay, that's as a young person, hey, you want to go out there and, making more money is the thing to do. Although that view has changed now after many years of life, right? And it's important, but you look at it differently. And so I think, yeah, I think it felt like that's the thing to do. Good action. We had colleagues and friends, and everybody seemed to be like everybody's talking about technology and AI and neuroscience now. It seemed like that was the in thing. And I had a good run, but I'm also glad that how paths change over a period of time, and what it led me to do in sort of the second phase of my career. So yeah.
So, you did that for a decade and then you pivoted. What did you turn to and why?
Yeah, so the pivot wasn't planned, Mary. I think um, I was well cruising along. I think had good company, good exposure. Moved to the West Coast, good, everything was moving along, I think. And then there's kind of a family event that happened, some health issues with my parents. Back back, I lost my mother.
Mhm.
And then I had to, so we decided that, okay, this is probably time to move back to Asia. And that's when I relocated. And I said, look, I'll do just about anything, but I won't teach, train, or get into consulting. But as I said, I think sometimes the path that you resist the most is the path that life takes you. And so I think I'd kind of slowly forward into doing some part-time teaching, and then I got a very good opportunity to kind of do leadership development work with a very good company, a global company based out of US, but they were trying to open offices in Asia, and that, and it grew into me. I think there was
Hmm.
a still a second thought in my head to say that, okay, I still don't belong here, and maybe this is like a fallback because I couldn't make it and so on. But anyway, I think as you age, you look at things as in careers and jobs to say that, look, what do you enjoy and are you happy? You could be making more money. And I think maybe after a few years of doing some of that, I felt like, look, this is much more satisfying. I'm making an impact. And fortunately, that last leg where I was there for about 12 years, I got to head that company. I traveled extensively, doing very senior leadership work and seeing companies and seeing leaders and seeing the issues, the people issues. And it just, I think it could have been the best thing that happened, right? But
Mm.
you have to travel through a path sometimes you don't know where it'll eventually take you. So it was completely unplanned, but as I say, sometimes fate takes you somewhere which you don't quite know, and it's for your better, right?
Yeah, absolutely. During that time when you were working in organizations and with senior leaders, were there any issues that kept on coming up? I'm very interested in conflict and how we deal with conflict so that we can have healthy work environments. Are there any issues that you saw continually coming up in these different organizations and with these leaders?
Sure. Fantastic question. I think Mary, from a lot of my work, which took me to many countries, was largely in the Asian context. So I think just as a sort of a background, which I think, I'm sure your listeners and our global listeners will also agree that uh, there is a certain hierarchical context that exists, and therefore in certain companies it's very top down.
Mhm.
So it's all about you take the order, you just execute, and you move forward. And then, of course, you have a set of companies which are global companies, but have subsidiary companies in Singapore and China and India and some of those places. So they have kind of a org culture, but they also have a subculture, right? And the subculture can be very interesting and different, considering that the parent company that's in Connecticut will be very different than what you see in Mumbai or somewhere else. And so I think many of those companies brought a very different viewpoint, and I can share some more about that. So that's that. And then of course there is sort of the homegrown local Asian companies as well, which grew into bigger companies, right? And I think these are promoter-led or entrepreneurially led companies which eventually professionalized, meaning to say that they were ran by the owner themselves for many, many years, but when they reach a certain height, they realize that they have to kind of let go ways of doing things. So that's just very broadly kind of telling you the different kinds of, you can think about how the firms existed. But uh, I think in many of the cultures, like for example, I used to go at NUS in Singapore for 10 years. I used to teach there the medical students. And this was a class made up of about 30, 40 nationalities. So many of our Western colleagues and students would come into the classroom and be very open about feedback. And this was a team-based program. So for 4 years, you have to be in a team setting. Like you can be a brilliant individual contributor, but like eventually your success is known in teams because the medical program in that country, Singapore, believed that look, if you can work in teams for 4 years, when you come out in hospitals, it's pretty seamless. You can work with nurses and admin people and doctors, and it's all very easy. So you could see that some of the cultural context coming in were in teams. Some of our colleagues would probably give feedback, but very anonymously. Some of our colleagues will give feedback, but in very different ways. And some of the other colleagues would be very, very upfront about it. So you could see some of that even in, let's say, at a college level. At the work level, I think in many companies, the other extreme, the spectrum would be where there are companies which are successful, but there's what I call an escalation culture, which means that nothing gets done until I CC their boss or I CC the boss's boss. And I think in many of those companies, you could just sense that there's a fair amount of stress in the system. There's a fair amount of I think difference between the boss and the subordinate for a variety of reasons. And I think things will only get done when it gets escalated.
Mhm.
And I think those are the companies where you would intervene and create leadership programs and so on. But to me, and we can talk more about this, to me, some of that requires some really changing of new routines, putting into practice newer things. As you know very well, you're such a deep expert in that space where It's not about like doing a program or two. It's about getting them to commit to do different things, right? So we can talk more about that. But I think in many of those companies, that was what we were seeing is that nothing got done until there was an escalation culture. And it just seemed like it was a blame game. It's not me, it's you. So I'll pause there, but we can double click on anything that you like.
Hmm. That is really interesting. I mean, I completely understand how an escalation culture comes into being, um, and and I think it can be a part of this sort of command control when you have a particular kind of structure that you think this hierarchical structure you think this is the best way that the people who are at the top are the ones who are greenlighting everything, and yet you don't really realize what you're doing, how you are disempowering and mucking up the system, and as you said, adding unnecessary stress
Yeah.
and deprofessionalizing people because they are not competent or not trusted to be competent enough to make decisions, and you're not developing leaders and all the problems that you may not, when we think about leadership styles or how things get done, we think, oh, it's this way or it's that way, and all different ways have different kinds of problems. But to really get into you don't have to look very far to see how
Yeah.
what you get with different kind of leadership styles, right? And the
Yeah.
happiness and the productivity of the
Yeah.
workers given the kind of style.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're so right. I think in many of those firms, what tends to happen is that, as you rightly just said, that leaders don't get developed, right?
Mhm.
They're taking orders, they're executing, and they don't. I mean, you see pockets of even in companies like that. You do see pockets where there are some pretty good leaders who have kind of shielded their teams and they've created a nice subculture for their team so they have the space to voice out what they believe and so that they grow and they kind of almost give them air cover. But for many others in the system they believe, and sadly as you say, like I think when you get exposed to that kind of leadership culture or culture, you'd start to believe that that's the way it's done. And especially, I think it's a little dangerous for some of the younger colleagues coming in the system, right? If you talk about the Gen Z or any of the people who are kind of just seeing that, then it becomes hard to unlearn that.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think that's one part of it. If you pivot on the other side, Mary, if you look at like a lot of the public sector companies, so we did a fair bit of work in government companies, and again, it's very, very hierarchical, almost to the point like if a senior or a boss says something like there is no room to disagree. I mean, you just take that and you go with it. And so you don't develop any critical thinking, you don't develop any communication skills, you don't develop any feedback skills. And I've seen people with 20 years, 30 years of, you know, experience in the workspace, but they kind of struggle with some of the very basic skills, right?
Mm.
And it's about just the culture that we want to create, and it takes so much more effort rather than doing one program. I mean, it has to be, you have to walk the talk, and you have to make sure that people have the space to kind of fail. And so much of what we do in this space, we talk about, safe to talk and all of that. But I always say that psychological safety doesn't, it's so much investment in the part of the manager, right?
Mhm.
You cannot just, it won't happen. It's the boss who has to invest the time. Only then the subordinate or the peer will step up. Only when he or she sees that consistently, that look, I can go into his room, or I can go into his cabin, or I can go into talking to him. 6 times I've done it, and all 6 times he's been smiling or she's been smiling. Only then he'll feel comfortable or right to kind of voice out. So I think some of that is there as we've spoken, and the conflict just goes away in some of those cultures, or it doesn't exist. From feet back to feet forward. But yeah, in other spaces, I think that culture can be very exhausting and damaging, and even damaging physically to your health.
Mhm. Yeah, exhausting and damaging versus it does take intentionality. It takes the long view, playing the long game. Like this is what I'm going to be doing every single day. And if there's a day that I slip up, I will apologize, make amends, and go forward so that I can consistently show up. And right, that's how we get psychological safety. It's not we have it because I say it. You
Yeah.
have it because people feel it, because of consistent action, this consistency of not walking on eggshells around my manager, of I know what to expect in this positive way, of really wanting to be heard, really, this really straightforward what people want to know the lay of the land, and when you get that consistently, and it is consistent that I want to hear what you have to say, and that you're not going to be, adversely affected for telling me what you really need or what you really think, but will be considered thoughtfully. This is to me basic professionalism, right? This is what we owe ourselves and the people around us, this real consistency so that we don't have unnecessary conflict. And we're going to have it, but we don't need to create it, right? We don't need to create it
Yes.
because we have poor management, bad systems, all of these sorts of things that will creep in if we don't do something different, if we don't make different conscious choices to have just to work differently, operate differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of also what happens, and again, I don't want to just generalize, but is also the fact that it's a high context culture, which means that it is almost, I use the whole sandwich feedback example as not the way to do it. I say that's the guilt sandwich you're eating, meaning you're feeling bad about saying something bad to somebody. But it's almost like I think you're feeling bad about that. And so how much do you sugarcoat, and how much do you tell? And there is always the view also in part, like in some of the companies, is that like if you're a boss, you need to have all the answers. I think the younger generation like sees through that, and the younger
Mhm.
generation will disrespect or like kind of almost say that, look, like I would rather much you respect if you're being authentic about it, right? And I think when you try to take that position, because I'm a boss, I have to solve every problem. And today the problems have become so complex, right? So that's where also there's that gap and the distrust happens and so on. And a lot of times companies actually, I'm just doing some workshops for a very large conglomerate. It's there, but because they're also on such a fast-paced growth trajectory, it's
Mm.
all well meant. There isn't any time for the boss or the boss's boss who are actually promoting even this the sake to speak kind of a concept, because they're always like finishing that next project, doing the next assignment, the next announcement that's going to happen. And I sometimes feel that even that can undermine or take away some of the well-meaning initiatives where you open up and talk with the bosses about different ideas. But sometimes, like in a lot of the companies in the economies in this side of the world, if they're growing at 7-8%, they're always running on the treadmill.
Mhm.
And therefore, I've seen companies where they just come to me and say that, you know what, like this is good, but I'm sorry, every time I go to the boss simply says that, how do we solve this? Let's solve this, and we'll talk about this a little later.
Yeah.
So I feel and empathize for managers in that situation.
Yeah. I do think it's right. Obviously, we want intentional growth and really purposeful thinking about what is it actually going to cost the organization and the people within it to wherever we want to go. And I have also seen these companies where they're innovating, they're this, they're that, and and
Yeah.
at the expense of the people. Maybe they're making these, but to me, I think it's short-sighted, but we are burning out people, you are trampling on them. And I think it's definitely worse to start an initiative and then to not follow through. It would have been better if you never went down that way. Don't give these people the training. Don't say we're going to do X and then not do it because we quote unquote don't have enough time. If you don't
Yeah.
have enough time to have a healthy work environment and to invest in your people, you always that is the right thing to be doing, right? It actually saves time. It builds organization. It's a cost effective. It's the moral thing to do. Uh, that just means you're looking at the wrong thing, spending time in the wrong way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So you now are, I mean, a variety of things that you do. I know that you're interested in leadership, but you're also interested in generational gaps at work and specifically Gen Z. And you've written two books on the subject. Can you tell us how you got into this interest in the writing and everything else about this particular topic?
Sure. So around 2018, I I think I had done about 12 years of very high-end leadership consulting. I was very fortunate to have traveled some 25, 30 countries and done programs, designed them, led them, delivered them. And, again, I was given a much higher role, which would have been more travel. But at the same time, my father wasn't keeping well, so I figured this is a good time for me to step down. I think I had seen enough by way of, the clients and the different assignments and so on. And in 2020, just when COVID came around, when I kind of jumped onto the dark side, uh, all the work that I was hoping to be kind of doing, everybody had to pivot to do online. So that was a learning for me. But that was the first time where I could see my nephew and my son inside the house and like see them very closely for the next 3 years, like how online learning was changing and what was happening. So, um, and personally, at the time I kind of lost, it was also a mixed phase because I lost my father. He wasn't keeping well. So I said that, okay, I'll write something in his honor, but what can I write? There's so much written on leadership, and there was so much written on Gen Z as well. But most of the books were written from the Western context. Very little was written from the Asian context. So I said that maybe this is a little forward looking. And it seems like there could be good curiosity about this generation, which everybody's talking about today. And so I started, looking back at my 12, 13 years to say that, okay, what were some of the lessons that I saw with companies and their career aspirations and all of that. And so I just said that okay, maybe I make it more like a memoir. I look at my two boys at the home, and then of course I did some research. And honestly, it was my very first attempt. Is I had my own imposter syndrome about okay, how am I going to write a book? But it finally happened, and to my surprise, it just grew. The book itself grew fairly well, but my curiosity even grew more. So I launched a podcast, which, is in the top two, top three in the Gen Z category across the world. It's heard in more than 70 countries now. And my focus is just to bring all the work dimensions, but from a Gen Z context, because every company that I talk to today, whether it's a small, large, mid-sized company, it's an Asian company, European company, American company. They all are bringing some story with the Gen Z that, hey, how do I hold on to them? Or there's another view that says that they're very, very talented, but there's this, there's that. And so that's how I began. And the first 2, 3 years, I think it was the book and then the podcast. And then the more I did my consulting work, I also realized it isn't just the Gen Z, it's the bosses and it's the peers and everything else. So I think that motivated me to write the second book, which is on multi-generation. So kind of looking at the other perspective. So how does the Gen Z see Gen Y and then the Gen Xers and how Gen Xers see the boomers and so on. So I think there I bring many stories about what I call the pods and the pops. What are the points of differences and the points of parity? So, what are the main issues that happen in a multi-gen system? And what are the ways in which we can bridge them? So, I think that's the second focus. But I sense that everybody who's talking about future of work, this is going to remain because every company today has at least 3 generations, in some companies, 4 generations. And it's becoming more and more pronounced with all the different issues about hybrid and the way they learn and the way they communicate and the way they see career. So many aspects I talk in the book about what is causing some of that and how do we overcome it. So again, I bring live stories about what I've seen and what ways in which we can kind of overcome it.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. I'm very interested in this, this East versus West, right? This Western version versus the Asian version of Gen Z. What kind of differences have you seen there? Similarities and differences.
No, excellent. I think there is a certain common denominator, Mary, which I would say exists, which is to say that they're very tech savvy. Okay, so in fact, if you look at a country like India, a lot of the TikTok videos that are being built are not being built in some of the bigger cities, they're actually being built in like what we call tier two or tier three cities, which is like smaller cities, and which means that there is equal consumption of online material that's happening in the world, and these are the people who are building the videos. So there is a certain common denominator about the fact that they're very tech savvy. There's also a certain common denominator of just the fact that they've seen a fair bit of what I call the quarter life crisis, which means that they've experienced a pandemic, they're experiencing wars, they're experiencing, the fake news movement, they're experiencing the Me Too kind of movement in their own world, right?
Mhm.
And the cyberbullying, all of that. And, I bring some of that stories in the book, but some of that I think is like the common denominator, and therefore you can see how the stereotypes that we attach to them on, being very fragile or, having less attention span and all of that, to some extent, I think their own context has just been like that. And so I think we have to be fair in like looking at that versus the other generation. So that I would say is some of the common sort of events across the globe. So normally when I do workshops, I will bring the events that happen in the Western world, and I'll talk about the events that happen in that particular region to say that how that's happened. So that's that. Now, in terms of the differences, again, I'll speak very, just generally about, let's say, a country like India, where the demographic heterogeneity is very complex. So if you go to a smaller town or a mid-sized town, the aspiration to grow is much more. They're much more driven, they're much more hungry, versus, let's say, if somebody's growing up in Delhi versus, let's say, Bangalore or anywhere else, like that Gen Z is like any other Gen Z in the world. They would have traveled everywhere, they would have seen the same sitcoms, and they kind of know the big brands and all of that. As a consumer, they're right up there. And so there is an element of, how do you see, which strata of economy or like financially where do you come from, and there's an element of that. Um, so there's that. There is also, for example, we talked about how do they see careers. So I've seen that people again who come out of the top B schools, they have an aspiration to say, I want to go work for a big four, I want to work for a McKinsey, or I want to work for a BCG. And they have this sort of pursuing a glamorous way of looking at a career versus someone who comes from, let's say, a smaller town. They're quite happy to work for a manufacturing company, quite happy to work for a few years before they kind of go up. And we've done this in our workshops where we've actually asked them, and they said that, what, I'm going to join your company, but can you tell me if I'll become a vice president in 10 years? And so you can see the distinct differences that you see in some of that, right? Again, similarities, they're good with technology and so on. How do they communicate, right? And we see differences there as well, like where certain generations communicate in certain way, and certain generations, like Gen Z, doesn't want to write emails, doesn't want to, they don't want to, they even feel lazy about writing short text messages, all about voice notes. So I think there's a fair bit of similarities, and there's a fair bit of sort of differences as well. And I think that the places in which this happens is how they learn, how they communicate, how they see the careers, how do they think about learning. So some of that is the place in which we see some differences, but also a good amount of similarities.
Mhm. So I want to talk about Gen Z and conflict at work. But before we talk about that, I want to hear about you. When you were a younger person, how did you think about and deal with conflict when you were working? And can you tell us about maybe a conflict you had and if you would do anything differently today or the same?
Oh yeah, good question. I absolutely positively would do something very differently, Mary, and I think it's the hindsight, as you mentioned. And all of us who are in the leadership space can agree that when you're an individual contributor, your self-awareness is much lower versus when you start managing people. And so I remember many years back, and I was leading a team at the very first time, and I think it was just one of those, very pivotal moments of the career where you had to know how you kind of show up every day versus how others show up. And those 2 years taught me so much. I mean, there were some direct conflicts, and I think I was managing also a fairly young group of people at the time. So it wasn't like I had worked for many years. So the age difference was there, but not like super big difference, right? And so, I think with the youth, you can bring the aggression, you can bring the, you can sort of, go head to head. And they were kind of doing that. So I think a lot of my sort of early first your job, I can really look back and say that some of that could have been handled so much more differently. And I just didn't have the reference point of leading other teams. But my next phase of leading teams was very different. I handled conflicts very differently, and I led the team very differently myself. So yeah, but I think it was more all about like, how do you question me? I'm the boss, and I'm not going to listen to you.
Mhm.
And I think there are rules. You need to follow the rules, and you don't question the rules. I mean, some of that just seems very like, okay, how did I do that? But that's the way in which, I mean, I have no shame in confessing that that's the way in which I was seeing it, which was hard for me, which was hard for them. But as we say, experience is the best teacher.
Mhm.
And I think they look back to say that, you know what, we could have been much more mature. I look back and say, I could have handled this differently. But we learn from our experiences.
I think that is a an aspect of youth in general, of more black and white thinking. Certainly when you're like young, yeah, like really young, 10, 12, and it's these are the rules. When I think about games, these are the rules. It's very black and white, and then you apply them to real life circumstances, and then you're in your 20s, and okay, here are the rules, and who's in charge, and oh, I'm in charge, and this is what you do. And it does take this development to figure out how to, where are the gray areas, what's negotiable, what's not negotiable, and even if something's not negotiable, how you approach it, right, to get what is the goal you have in mind. So what was that change in you that went from sort of this more aggressive, I'm the leader, this is what has to happen, to a more fruitful, dynamic, collaborative way of dealing with conflict?
So I think, Mary, there were two elements. One, of course, was the experience from doing it in one way and the org culture that existed. I think the culture itself was more about like, okay, Nikhil, you're going to be responsible for doing this. Like, just do it. We want you to get the results. How you manage your team, it's like your headache.
Mm,
And so I think while there was support, I was also like, I just like the leader is, always keeping his KRA or her KRA and thinking that, okay, I've got to just somehow make this. Versus when I moved to other organizations, I think it was much more all about like, how do we help people that we manage shine? So it was like flipping
mm,
I mean, we had one of the values in which we had five values for this one company, where one of the values was how do we make others look good?
mm,
So in every project, in every client win, in every delivery, it was always about acknowledging a junior person in the team or a subordinate in the team. And I think that really changed the way you look at people and the way you
mm,
kind of, tell how, even if they haven't done a good job, like how do we coach them, right? So I think there was one element of that. And I think parallelly, what helped me really is just the ringside view that I was getting from seeing clients, Mary, which was fantastic to see that, okay, I'm seeing someone else doing it correctly. I should learn
mhm,
that, or I'm seeing someone else not doing it correctly. And so I could see that, as I was mentioning in the beginning, that the escalation culture was just some really good stories about like fantastic stories about like how they did it, and even in large organizations. So you have some of that sort of osmosis effect on you and the culture itself. But I really think that we all have to be fortunate to have good leaders and mentors and bosses for us to kind of bring that for the people that we lead. So there was a phase where I had two fantastic bosses and mentors, and I could see how they were handling some of the differences that I would have with them, and then I could see some of that I need to take it to the teams that I was managing, and I was very happy and proud to say that, like in one of the companies I was there for 12 years, we had the same team for 12 years, like
mm,
not one person left, which to me was not all credit to me, but I'm saying like I think everybody was doing their part. We were trying to help each other, look after each other, sort of like the dream team. And and so I think you learn from the top, you learn from the organization, you learn from the clients, you learn from the mistakes that you made, and a combination of that.
Absolutely. When we think about being a lifelong learner, sometimes people think, I'm going to constantly be getting, reading articles and books and getting certifications. And maybe that's part of it. But really, a lot of it is having your eyes open, looking around and paying attention to what's going on around you so that you learn from the good, bad, and the ugly, right? And that you're able to see what works and what doesn't and why it works and why it doesn't. And then assimilate the good and cut out the bad and constantly developing, right? I think that's a lot of what lifelong learning is this idea that we're constantly that everybody around us is an opportunity to learn and grow, and we can constantly reflect on ourselves to see what are we doing well, to do more of that, what are the things that we can let go of because maybe it served us, maybe it never
Hmm.
really did, but we were doing it anyway. But this
Yeah.
openness to our own evolution as and if we're so fortunate as you were to be able to have good leaders around us, it's such a gift to have people who are really good at what they do be a part of our lives that we get to benefit. And a lot of the benefit, like when you see it from the outside, right, as a
Hmm.
consultant, you can see it from the outside, but when you're in it and that person is directly affecting you and you see it every day, it
Yeah.
and grace is poured upon you and insight is given to you and somebody's stretching and believing in you, that what it does to a person, how it can change. And of course we know what a toxic leader can do to a person and how they can change,
Yeah.
but we should not underestimate the real power of the individual at work and leaders at work.
Absolutely, 100%. I think, and there are lots of books, Mary. I think you all know, but there's a particular gentleman that I always quote with saying that, like, I think your first 10 years of the work life are so important for any of us, and like we have to be fortunate enough. And I say this to all our listeners that I think, especially like if there are any young listeners, to say that, you owe it to yourself to look for a company which gives you that right culture and the right boss. Now, you obviously can't choose a boss, but I think that homework needs to be done because oftentimes there's so much peer pressure and, all about like, look, person X is making this salary and I want to make X times Y and whatever. All that is fair, but the point is that I think if you pick the right habits from a good mentor, it just shapes the way in which you look at leadership, right? And therefore, to me, I think that is so very important. And I think that'll be the one message that I would say that it's worth your while to do that trade-off. Meaning to say that take the first few years where you really get to see people who lead it the right way, people who do it in a way where it inspires you. And I see a lot of times people just don't have that reference point. People are there in a company for 25 years and 30 years, and they still believe that escalation is the way to go, and non-confrontational conflict is the way to do it, and doing it more surreptitiously and doing it in a very, these are all things that I think you've never addressed the elephant, or you've never been exposed, rightly or wrongly, for a variety of reasons. And so I say that in nowadays today, that we're so fortunate to live in a time where you can go to the websites where you can see what people are experiencing, and Glassdoor is there and Fishbowl is there, and they can kind of tell you some part of the story, right? And it, yeah, I think I think for most of us who are in the leadership space, we agree that the jump from the individual contributor, the first time manager, is so very critical, and then you go from there to managing managers. Hopefully you've done and got a good exposure where you can then guide the people that are underneath you, right? So oftentimes people who are getting to that stage after 15 years or 20 years of experience, they're struggling with people skills themselves, and
Mhm.
therefore they don't give the right answers to the people underneath them who are managing teams themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so that experience, I think, I always say that that is very crucial, and I also believe that that's the experience in which you have to go through some tough moments,
Hmm.
right? Which means that if you have a tough customer or a tough boss or a peer, or you have to collaborate across regions, across time zones, because that really teaches you. The more you can kind of push yourself over those few years, it builds that sort of repository of experience for you when you get to about 10 years in your career.
Yeah. And I think that's, it's one thing to kind of take a step back and look at the trajectory of a career. When we're in it, a lot of times we don't have that perspective, but we can decide to have that perspective, right? Wherever we are in our career, we can decide to say, okay, I'm not just working at this place, I'm a professional, and what is made up of who I am and where I want to be. And so even a young person can definitely do this and say, okay, well, this is my first professional job, or I'm in my 20s and okay, where do I want to go? How do I see myself? And this, or if you're in your 40s or 50s or 60s, 70s, wherever you might be, you can take yourself out. And I think that's very empowering, especially if you find yourself in a difficult situation, or maybe there's a bully at work, or just a bad manager, or something else is going on in the system. If you can extract yourself and say, is this a learning opportunity for me? Where do I want to go? How does this fit into what I want my life to be about? And that longer view can help understand what's going on, understanding if this is a place where I can stay and be a part of the solution, or do I need to develop an exit strategy, and how long is that going to take me to get where I want to go? So, of course, a lot of times in our organizations, right, we have conflict. Conflict is normal. Conflict's not the problem. It's the unmanaged conflict. So, how do you see Gen Z um, approaching conflict, dealing with conflict? What kind of feedback do they want when they're doing something that needs to be addressed? What do you see?
Yeah, no, excellent. I think, Mary, again, it's hard for us to. We always want to be cautious of generalizing an entire
Yes.
generation. So, I think I'll just put that disclaimer. But on a whole, look, I think this is a generation which has a lot of access to information, so they can validate, cross-check what a boss is saying, what a company is talking about, and putting on their vision, mission statement against like stories and, is this real or so on. So I think they do have that advantage, if you will, and maybe the prior generations, all were happy to kind of take a job and, in a good way, like they were just happy to kind of work with the boss, whether it was good or bad. With this generation, again, I mean, you see two camps where, like, if they see something, they'll call it out. But what this generation definitely is much more vocal is about the authenticity they expect from the leaders and managers and the companies that they're working for, right? So it is not about the positional authority as much as about like, okay, my boss is quite real. Like he is quite happy to admit that he's not good with this, but he's really good with these three things. And I think therefore I respect him. I think managers who are leading Gen Z, and I have done exclusive workshops, Mary, just for Gen Ys and Gen Zs, thinking that okay, these are two very similar generations, and it couldn't be true because Gen Ys don't see the Gen Zs like that. So I always say a couple of things here. One is that at least in the Asian context, and I'm sure like this is true to some degree in the US as well, that let's say you're in a workshop and you have a class full of Gen Ys and Gen Xers. And I always tell them that, look, we're doing this workshop in 25, or let's say now in 26. Let's fast forward. And if I were to do this workshop 5 years from now, 10 years from now, how many people do you think will be in the room that you're in? Like how many, what will be the composition of that room? There's a good chance many of the Xers will be out. Many of the Xers could be on their way out, meaning to say that they're sort of in the last 15 years of the runway of their career, and the Gen Ys are entering into the late 40s and 50s. Which means what? Which means that over the next 20 years that you've left, there is a very good chance that you will have to work very closely with Gen Z, whether you like it or you don't like it. And if you don't have a Gen Z now, there is a runway of at least 20 years for both of those generations where a good chunk of that will be with the Gen Z. So it is in your good interest to kind of get to know what inspires them, what motivates them, and so on. And I think when you ask me about the feedback, I think a lot of the companies are which are still doing the traditional way of the bell curve and doing it at the end of the year or end of the quarter. I really find that they're just grappling with issues of engagement, issues of attrition, issues that we normally say that, okay, why is this happening? Because they don't have a pulse of what is happening with the team that I'm managing. And I see this especially with like pharmaceutical companies or financial services companies where like a large chunk of the bread and butter comes from sales teams, which means like these are young people trying to sell products and sell policies and sell, you know, drugs or whatever, right? So, medical drugs, that is. And therefore, it is about like making sure that you tell them what happened then and there, right? And this sounds very obvious, but not many managers do it. And therefore, I always say like feedback doesn't have to be very onerous. It can be something where I say there are three simple things that managers need to do. One is the ability to communicate the goals. I think more often managers struggle with that, meaning to say that it comes from top down. You take what's coming and you just push it down, and that's it. Now, when things change, outside and the inside, you want to be transparent. You want to communicate, and I would say that the manager needs to get out of their comfort zone to do that. So that's the first thing. Second is just to check and see how they're doing, really just have a pulse of what's happening, right? I think as long as they can do that, I think that itself is a big part of the story. Like there's so much research on high performing teams, and these are the three things that they say: communication of goals, talking about feedback, and not so much on just what they did wrong, how do we help them succeed in the forward? And the third, of course, is recognition. And I also said that the recognition doesn't have to be confined to like a higher pay, just a nice email, like a day off, or like let's say some perk over the weekend or something or the other, right? Like some free tickets or something, like whatever the company can do. And I find that if you can just do some of that, um, they're very happy, and you have to, but I do say that the manager today has to work more harder to make sure that the Gen Z is engaged. And you can blame and say this, that, the other, but you just need to do your part. And I flip it around and also have done workshops for Gen Zs where I talk about productivity and time management and all the other things. And I also say that, look, it's not just your bosses, it's also you. How do you do things differently so that they feel like, okay, they have to manage some good people. So I think it's both ways, but I would go back to say transparency, making sure you communicate oftenly, reward, creating engagement. I think that is the number one thing that is essential for that cult, for that generation, like just keeping
Mm.
them engaged.
I love
I
that.
don't
And
know if
as
that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. And as you were talking, and I think this is the wonderful thing about multi-generational workplaces is that I want all of those things, right? I want transparency. I want regular check-ins. I want recognition. I mean, these are pretty human asks. And I think for a long time, people just, you're thankful you have a job, you suck it up and you do it. And but the more and more we realize, it's brought to our attention that most of our life is spent at work. What if we made it more human? What if we made it better? What if we made it, there's all these things that we can do that we can demechanize because we're human persons, right? And maybe this is a wonderful thing about AI is that as AI comes more into the frame, we can see, okay, well, what are we? What are we good at? Well, we're human persons. Let's stop trying to turn people into cogs. And let's stop trying to mechanize everything like this year-end evaluation as if I personally wish I could do away with that because it's not doing what you think it's doing. And maybe it did at one time, and I'm doubtful there. But it's certainly, if you want engagement, if you want people to be able to correct mistakes, if you want people to, you know, all the good things, well, you're not going to get it with a year-end evaluation. I don't think.
Yeah. I just say, just to add one last bit, Mary, I just said a couple of things. One is that, in a normal bell curve, there's always like 10%, which is ahead of the curve, and there's the large chunk in the middle, and then of course, you have sort of the laggers. I think in any system, if we can take what motivates the 15% and try and clone them, then that's the secret, right? Because the biggest challenge is how do we take the chunk in the middle and move them towards the left? And therefore, a lot of the companies that I work with, I say that, okay, why don't we make the 15 which are there on this side as champions, and let's just get them to do and tell their secrets. So a Gen Z is much more likely to respect that other peer who has the same constraints and how he or she is making it. And I think if we can just give them, to say that, look, somebody else is doing it, right? It's not, all you, and so on. So that's one. And the other piece I say is the whole bit of nonviolent communication, right? So I think I'm a big proponent of that, just to get managers to express how they feel
Yeah.
about themselves and see the others. I think, and I'll just say this to kind of stick my neck out. I think male managers on perhaps more than female managers struggle even more to express feelings and and uh, and therefore I've seen that a lot of the bosses who are males, we push that even hard to say that look, it isn't good to suppress it down, whether it's to your boss or for somebody else. So NVC to me is such a great way to communicate and give the feedback without being, very aggressive about feedback. And I think the Gen Z generation will likely appreciate that so much more if done correctly.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm a big proponent of nonviolent communication as well. The more that we can understand, I mean, this is what a wonderful way to solve conflict, right? So we get past what our positions are to our needs and then understanding the emotions, right? So the more that we are emotionally literate, the more that we understand that there are a variety of needs, then we can be creative together and curious. And I believe, and I imagine you would agree with me here, is that one way we bridge these gaps is we recognize them, but then we get curious. I
Yeah.
think the huge problem right now is that we recognize them and then we stop and then we vilify. And you're wrong. I've noticed this. You're wrong. Instead of I've noticed this. What can that lead to? How can this make us stronger? How do we need to communicate? How do we need to change? Who needs to change? Like all of these wonderful, curious questions, because the fact of the matter is, and you already said this, we are all working together. I mean, we are all in the workplace right now. And if you don't have all the generations, actually, that's not good for you, right?
Yeah.
Because you're serving everybody. So we should want multi-generational work environments. And so we should expect that there be a diversity of thought, opinion, and need and desire. Okay, so now we have these expectations because I mean, this is what is happening. What are we going to do? If we bemoan it, what a wasted opportunity. And you're going to just burn people out and the good people will leave and then you'll get what's left, right?
Yep.
So it is in our best interest to figure it out. And it's never going away. We will always have multi generations at work. So let's age proof our organizations and figure out how to work well and respect each other instead of vilifying and minimizing each other.
Absolutely. You said it well.
All right. Well, I guess I could talk. I can see the hour is just escaping. I could talk to you for so long. So this is my ending question. When you look into the future of work, and so, uh, your boys are out into the workforce, what do you think needs to happen so that not only will they be treated with dignity and respect, all workers, but that all workers will be encouraged to thrive and flourish?
Yeah. uh, what a great question. I think, one of the biggest, like you rightly just said, Mary, generations have always existed. And it isn't a newer concept. We see that in our personal lives with parents and grandparents and great grandparents and so on. So I think they've existed, and then we all have our own stories of what happened in the childhood, and now maybe our children are kind of flipping it and saying it for us. But at the workplace, um, I would say that I think every one of us, whichever generation you are, in simple leadership parlance, I think if we can just take the time to become more self-aware, that becomes a good part of solving the issue, right? So like I know who I am, this is my blueprint, and I need to be mindful of like I'm not doing this or I overdo this. So that's the other one. So that's the first thing. Second is of course just be very mindful of the stereotypes, right? Because the stereotypes are just that. I think we need to, and there's also the term of meta stereotypes, right? Which means like, I carry the stereotype of my own self, and like therefore the awareness comes in. And a lot of it is just like being aware that, okay, what that is. And there are many methods, and I talk in my workshop about how do we overcome that. So that's that. And then third is just to say that how do we rewire ourselves, right, in this kind of situation. So to me, with all the advent of the technology that's happening, I would say that the managers today owe it to the younger generation to bring the human connection, because I see my sons and I see my nephews, they're like they're using technology, and it's all very good. what AI can do, but look, it shouldn't come at the cost of like, AI is not like the human friend that, or substitute of human friend who will solve my emotional problems or, become my doctor. The AI has its own sort of pluses and boundaries of what we should do with AI or a generative AI kind of tool, right? The connection of humans still remains. And therefore, I sense that that is very crucial for the generations going forward, like Gen Alpha and Gen Beta and Gen Z. Because we think about like if AI is in its infancy now, think about the next 20, 30, 40 years, like what could that look like?
Yeah,
Right. And so I think that's one big message. And as I mentioned, self-awareness, being mindful of the stereotypes and just being rewiring. I think if we can keep that simple, look, work will always be there, technology will come and go. And as you rightly said, generations will always exist. And if we can do that, not only will this be good for the people at the workplace, but also in the personal life, I think.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I had such a wonderful time talking with you about this, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Absolutely, Mary. Really enjoyed it and all the very best in everything that people are doing.
Absolutely. Well, take care. Nikhil, thank you so much for being on Conflict Managed. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I really appreciate the work that you are doing in this area of trying to think about how to have healthy work environments that are multi-generational, because our work environments are multi-generational. That is the reality. And whether you like it or not, it is true. And let's like it because it is what we have. And therefore, we can have less resistance to have real change so that everybody can have a healthy work environment. Conflict Managed is produced by third-party workplace conflict restoration services and hosted by me, Mary Brown. You can find us online at 3pconflictrestoration.com. Come back. We have new episodes every Tuesday. And if you haven't had a chance to check out my latest book, which is Winning the Generation Wars at Work, Making Your Age an Asset, it's available on Amazon and locally in West Tennessee if you live here in West Tennessee. Our music is courtesy of Dove Pilot. And remember, conflict is normal and expected. Let's deal with it. Until next time, take care.